Hello, welcome to Season 2 of The Cusp. This podcast is a production of WorkShift, a nonprofit news outlet that covers connections between education and work. The first season of the show focused on how artificial intelligence is changing jobs and what that means for education and job training. We're still going to talk about AI this season, but we're going to shift a bit to talk about workforce education more broadly. It's an uncertain time. The labor market and post-secondary education are poised for continued change in 2025, as is the policy landscape. Our first episode features Rachel Lipson, a senior policy advisor for Chips for America at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Like many of you, I knew Rachel before she headed to Washington a couple years ago through her work at the Project on Workforce at Harvard, an initiative she co-founded. Among other achievements from her time there, Rachel co-edited the book America's Hidden Economic Engines, which features case studies on how community colleges can drive shared prosperity. Rachel and I had a lot to talk about with CHIPS and the Commerce Department's approach to workforce development. So without further ado, let's get to the conversation. Rachel Lipson, thanks for chatting with me.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So it's been a busy stretch for you at the Commerce Department. I've met you from your role before, but if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit of a flavor of your work at the department, what you've been focused on.
Definitely. So, yes, it's been a bit of a crazy stretch, not to say the least, because I think Paul, I have a 7-month-old. I came back from parental leave the week of the election. So, juggling a lot of different hats right now. It's been quite a run. I joined the Department of Commerce back in March of 2023. This is my first stint in the federal government. I previously co founded and was running the project and workforce at Harvard before I came over. But I think I joined at an exciting time for both the department more generally and the CHIPS program office, which was really just getting off the ground in those early days. The CHIPS and Science Act passed in the summer of 2022. So this was March. When I joined the team, I think we were about 50. And within a few months, we were over 150. So rapid startup and scaling stage. Because of that, I've actually worn a few different hats during my time in the office. A consistent theme, of course, given my background, I've done a lot of work focused on the workforce development strategy for the manufacturing incentives program, but also have supported some of the collaboration with our research and development office. And then close to my heart, I've been kind of a person that straddled the worlds of economic and workforce development. So helped stand up what we called our cluster strategy for CHIPS. And in the last few months, I've also been lucky to spend some time working on what we call special projects with the Secretary's office, including some of the department wide workforce and regional competitiveness agenda. So it's been a great portfolio, and I've gotten to work with great colleagues here at the department, but perhaps most importantly, also a really incredible set of partners around the country who are key to driving some of this work on the ground.
Yeah, that is a lot. You have been busy. So, in that time, obviously the department's become a major player in workforce development in some ways that are really new, I think, for the federal government. But could you start with just giving us a sense of the workforce development investment and structure specific to CHIPS and where they stand now?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe what would be useful first, I know it's a workforce and education audience here for the most part, so not sure how closely of people have been tracking what's going on with chips overall. So maybe I'll start there and
Please.
then talk
Yeah,
about the workforce work.
be
So
great.
look, I think at the broadest level right now, the United States is in the midst of a pretty exciting advanced manufacturing investment boom and renaissance that we haven't really seen with any modern precedent. And that's all in a large part been catalyzed by the CHIPS and Science Act and our work here in the CHIPS program office. So over the last 4 years, the US has seen more investment in electronics manufacturing than the previous 3 decades combined, and about 450 billion now in private investment. That's the largest scale of semiconductor manufacturing expansion in US history. So, the aspirations of the CHIPS and Science Act were really to bring domestic manufacturing back home and scale up our manufacturing efforts, as well as to seed the next generation of research and development here in the US. In the CHIPS program office, we've awarded now more than $33 billion. That's about 86% of the full allocation. And more than 96% of the funding has been allocated. And the R&D office has announced over 7 billion. Just to put into context what that means, if you think about the impact on the country, CHIPS funds are going to support the construction of 17 new fabrication facilities. That's the equivalent to about 119 football fields or 6.8 million square feet in clean room space. We're also funding 8 new supply chain and advanced packaging facilities and more than a dozen investments that are modernization or expansions of existing facilities around the country. And I think one of the most exciting parts is that when you look at leading edge technology, those really frontier technologies, all 5 of the world's leading manufacturers are building and expanding here in the United States. And we're the only economy in the world that has that presence. No other country has more than 2 of those companies.
Just quickly, for people who haven't followed this closely, and I actually assume most of this audience has, how moribund was the manufacturing in this industry in the United States? Like, what point are we starting from?
Well, if you look at the leading edge technology, which is what I was just referencing, previously, before chips, we were at 0% of the leading edge, and we're now on track for more than 20% by the end of the decade. So it's a pretty significant boost. Of course, many folks may know chip manufacturing. Chips were invented in the United States. We started here. Most of the key technologies were invented here. But over the course of a few decades, a lot of the manufacturing has moved abroad, and we had sort of steadily lost market share in both logic chips and memory chips. And so, one of the first things that we did here at the CHIPS program office back in February of 2023 is we laid out a vision for success of what we were trying to achieve with these public funds, both in terms of what we wanted to see for the technology, for the manufacturing footprint, and laid out some goals. And the numbers I'm citing are from our most recent this week. We released a kind of a 2-year revisit of that, which I think is pretty impressive to see really the scale of what's been achieved relative to those goals.
Well, let's get into the jobs piece, starting with chips and what you all have achieved and plan to achieve going forward, and also, how that relates to other commerce workforce initiatives.
Yeah, definitely. So if you look at the investments that I referenced earlier, we project that just in direct jobs, those manufacturing investments are going to create approximately 125,000 jobs across the US associated with these facilities. And what we have said at the CHIPS program office from the start is that workforce development, it's not just a nice to have, it's a critical pillar of how we approach the program as a economic and national security priority. So I think what you see overall is that the department has really delivered on what was asked of us from the CHIPS Act, which is that we needed to invest in workforce at a scale that in many ways we really haven't seen since the height of the Cold War. And that's kind of a multifaceted, multi-pillared strategy. So, of course, there's a substantial role for the federal funds. To date, we've now announced nearly $300 million that are dedicated CHIPS workforce dollars that are accompanying the announcements of the construction or expansion of these facilities. So that's supporting over 25 chips funded manufacturing facilities across over a dozen states. And again, these are integrated into the award structure for companies and will support the training, the retention, the advancement of workers that will both construct and operate these manufacturing facilities. In addition to that, we've announced a $250 million investment in the National Semiconductor Technology Center's Workforce Center of Excellence. This is really a flagship, purpose built entity that's a public private partnership between the Department of Commerce, many of our federal partners, as well as industry. It's going to be focused on really developing some of the innovative national solutions that are required for addressing some of the pressing workforce challenges in this industry. Our R&D office is also supporting workforce funds, especially for advanced packaging, for measurement science, for related fields. The department has made a joint commitment to the National Network for Microelectronics Education, which is a cross agency effort with the National Science Foundation, as well as with the NSCC. That's really going to help scale some of the educational resources across the country. But that's just the federal piece. And I think we're really playing a kind of a catalytic role in mobilizing some of the other private and state and philanthropic investments that we want to see for this truly kind of whole of nation effort. There are now, for what we've been tracking, over 14 states that have announced new funding for semiconductor workforce development, specifically to support these jobs created by chips, totaling over $300 million. We've seen over 200 million and counting in public announcements from companies of the private capital that they're spending towards new and incumbent worker training. And I could go on here for a while, but I do think it's a kind of a flagship moment for advanced manufacturing in the country that's happening here. And chips is at the forefront of showing what you can do when you have a really focused approach on a industry of strategic national importance.
Yeah, and just to hammer home that philosophical kind of starting point, I mean, I've been struck talking with you and your colleagues about the really novel marriage of economic and workforce development, and feels very different than what we've seen with other federal agencies, but also, working in national and economic security as well. Correct that all those pieces come together to drive the bus here.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it. Look, when the Chips and Science Act passed, Congress was part of the reason here that they said we are going to have these 12 technology focus areas that are critical and emerging technologies that really matter for the country's national economic security. And Commerce has picked up on that and really implemented towards driving towards that, which is to say that we need to actually make some big bets on driving towards areas of national importance. And that requires maybe doing things a little bit differently, as I think your question hinted at.
Yeah, and to that end, obviously, there's a lot of what you're doing in the weeds that's quite novel. Certainly, again, feels that way to me as a layperson trying to report on this. The data you're using and creating, the outcomes metrics that you're using, the incremental funding. Could just give us a flavor of some of the pieces, the innovations that have emerged in this work specific to workforce, and how you hope that could be part of the legacy here.
Yeah, maybe I'll step back first and give a view towards department wide footprint and impact. So, over the last 4 years, Commerce has deployed over 70 billion now in what you might call new place-based investments. So these are geographically concentrated programs that advance this kind of regional competitiveness agenda we've been talking about. These are new programs that were created under the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure law, CHIPS, and the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's CHIPS, of course, but also a number of new economic development administration programs, tech hubs, Recompete, Good Jobs Challenge, the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, also Internet for All, the broadband expansion. There's a set of new climate resilience program from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that are here in the Department of Commerce that are both driving regional strategies and workforce. So across all of those, I said 70 billion overall. The other number I'll throw at you is 2.9 billion is what we've tallied that's been invested in workforce development across the department over the last 4 years. And that's, I don't think it will come as a surprise to the listeners, is a significant boost relative to Commerce's traditional role as a workforce investor. Of course, the department has long been an important player on the federal side in workforce development policy. We are the department that works closely with employers, has shaped employer practices. The Manufacturing Extension Partnership, Manufacturing USA. If you think about data, the Census Bureau, of course, is part of the Department of Commerce. So we're building on a kind of a long history of engagement on these issues. But over the last 4 years, I think the extent to which Commerce has really been a programmatic investor in workforce is at a scale that we have not seen before. And yeah, happy to talk a little bit more about some of the distinctive approaches across these different bureaus and programs that I think are exemplified in a lot of ways by CHIPS.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that is a substantial amount of money for any agency. I mean, you know better than I do. It compares nicely to WIOA's overall budget. So, big player, new approaches, and I would very much love to hear what you see as some of the kind of significant developments in how you all have approached workforce development.
Yeah, so I think we've referenced a few of them, but maybe I can expand in a little more detail. Paul, you talked a little bit about connecting economic and workforce development, and what does that actually really mean? And look, this may sound obvious because we are the Commerce Department, but I think what you've seen that's different here in the last 4 years is that we're making some pretty large investments in communities with really like the scale and the strategy that are going to be required to help them transform an economy or transition or support a new industry, not just a sort of small targeted one off grant with one particular objective that it's trying to achieve. These are a much more kind of integrated, holistic approach. So, yes, you have workforce, but it might be alongside, of course, in the CHIPS case, alongside a much larger package that's supporting the development of a manufacturing ecosystem. Or it could be alongside small business development and entrepreneurship support and the associated infrastructure. What you're seeing is a national strategy and then communities coming around the table with their own theory of the case, putting forward their own kind of vision for how they can contribute to advancing those national goals. If you look at CHIPS, one thing you'll see as an example of the integration of economic development, but also sort of the ability for the department to make some bigger bets is that you'll see kind of our largest workforce investments are clustered in certain regions of the country that have projects that have the largest capex. They're supporting leading edge technology. They have the largest, in most cases, expected direct jobs. But of course, importantly, they have huge follow on supply chain effects. So you're expecting a lot of indirect jobs that are going to come as a result of the investment. And we're putting large amounts of workforce funding in those particular places because these are the sets of ecosystems that are going to really require that kind of catalytic startup and acceleration to get going. So that's kind of one model. I think it's certainly true of the other programs as well. If you look at tech hubs or Build Back Better, Regional Challenge, they're also really focused on this scale question and what's going to be required, not just for incremental change, but to really transform an economy. I do want to give a shout out to Recompete here, which I think is sort of in some ways contrasts with CHIPS, but is a really transformative program that also highlights the innovation of a kind of a new kind of approach. When I was first getting into this field as a researcher, one of the things that I found dogmatically most frustrating was when people were saying, align to your local labor market, align to your local labor market. And I think if you're a struggling geography that doesn't have a lot of good jobs right now, where does that leave you? And so if you look at a program like Recompete, what it's saying is actually, we're going to need a new approach for places that have been facing long term unemployment and significant economic distress. And you can't really just train your way out of the problem. If you integrate economic and workforce development, what that means is like you can have some sort of true thesis that is tackling job creation at the same time that you're working on human capital development, or that this kind of public money can play a catalytic role in really helping to get new industries started, create those new jobs, and also, of course, train and place people to fill them. So I think in some ways, if you think about it from like an economics perspective, what's nice about the integration of economic and workforce development is you're sort of putting supply and demand in the same picture at the same
Right.
time, being able to look at them right next to each other instead of having systems that are operating in isolation where the education system is trying to think about the growth of their programs without a direct connection to what's going on in terms of job growth in their local economy.
Yeah, obviously that's the core of what we report on and what often doesn't go well. And in this case, it's there from the beginning, including that strong employer role in these ecosystems and partnerships. Can you give me a sense of, where you see that really working, of how employers have played a different role than one might think in kind of a traditional training workforce environment?
So first, I mean, I definitely think it's worth recognizing Secretary Raimondo's role here, who has been very clear and consistent from the outset, which is that training needs to focus on real jobs. That sounds like a simple statement, but it's really been core across all of these programs, which is, we're not here to do train and pray.
Right.
We need to focus on job placement. That's the most important metric. All of the outcomes tracking that we do needs to build around that. And I also think that commerce certainly has not been ashamed, therefore, to say that employers need to play a key role, that they need to be at the table in a major way as part of these sort of grand strategies for regions that are focused on growing new and emerging fields. And across all the programs, I think you'll see a kind of a strong coalitional approach, which is what's going to be required, not just for an education and training institution to deliver on a grant, but actually how do we get a whole set of different community stakeholders around the table, inclusive of the employers, of wraparound service providers, of labor, of colleges, of economic development organizations, of industry groups, all kind of working together towards a shared strategy. That looks like a little bit different in the EDA programs than it has in the chips manufacturing funding, which flows first to companies, right?
Right.
But I think a lot of the same principles hold true, and the work at EDA has inspired in a lot of ways how we've have shaped and grown the approach for chips.
And in terms of, you mentioned the outcomes tracking being, about real jobs. First of all, I'm not sure many federal grant programs that do workforce have outcomes tracking that, are about any jobs, let alone real jobs and good jobs, right? Like good jobs often that don't require a 4-year degree in the case of some of the technician roles. Give me a sense of how novel, how new that approach is that's starting with that requirement.
Well, I will say I think it's easier to do when you have the employers at the table. So that's a big piece of this, right? If the employers are part of what you're doing at the onset and are partners or the leads on funding, then the job is it's not just some discrete thing that a training or education provider has to try to like figure out down the line what happens. In a lot of ways, we're investing with the mentality of the job first. And so that kind of changes the equation a little bit. On the CHIP side, the CHIPS program office has been working in partnership with the NSCC Workforce Center of Excellence on what I think is some pretty novel and exciting technology infrastructure that on the front end is going to make it much easier to collect information about CHIPS funded training participants, who they are, and basic personal information so that we can then on the back end safely store PII, personally identifiable information, and facilitate data sharing so you can kind of easily link to administrative data on what happens to these participants over time? What are the outcomes? In a world, you can do this not just in terms of whether they get placed, but also what happens to them over the course of their career, right? So, this is exciting work that's underway, and I think can really enable some best in class research, which is near and dear to my heart, that can help shape some of the future of US workforce policy here. And there's lots of great data work and innovation happening across the department. Maybe you followed that Census and EDA are working together on the Good Jobs Challenge to also understand the effects of training on outcomes like wages and employment. So, yes, I think there's recognition that the work that's happening here is important even beyond these individual programs. And how do we make sure that we take the opportunity to really understand effectiveness and inform future policy, and also make sure we're truly protecting taxpayer funds and that public money is being spent well.
Well, to that end, obviously, this is a time of transition. We've got inauguration coming up. A lot of questions about the CHIPS funding, the clean energy funding as well. And it sounds like we'll see. Every day brings a new development. But the congressional Republicans, despite Mike Johnson's making it sound like maybe the CHIPS money wasn't safe, actually it will be safe. We'll see. But beyond all of that, thoughts about what you hope the legacy of this work under this administration might be? What are some of the elements you'd like folks to pay attention to and to bring with them in future work, both at Commerce, but also like the rest of the federal government and states and local economic development projects?
The first thing I'd say is when you think about continuity and sustainability of the efforts, I referenced this at the beginning, but truly one of the best parts of my job has been getting to work with the local partners on the ground, and the amount of enthusiasm and progress that they are making to support these real jobs in their communities, I think should give everyone a lot of hope for what's ahead, because the momentum has been building. And at some point, you have to look at what they've done. And it's hard to see how that can be rolled back. If you think about over 80 community colleges across 22 states that are expanding or starting new semiconductor programs, if you look at the companies and you think about over 20 now that are committed to apprenticeships. When we looked at the sum of our portfolio, they have cited 600 plus strategic partners across the different regions that they're working with, inclusive of educational partners, but also nonprofits and labor partners. So there's a lot that's kind of moving on the ground, and in some places, construction has already started. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've made a lot of progress in the final awards going out. So the work is really just getting started, and I'm excited to watch the CHIPS efforts in the coming years ahead. When I stop and extrapolate out, I think, and again, there's a lot here that's still early days, but some of the early lessons that I think can inform states and localities and other federal partners thinking about these efforts. I think the best sort of archetype for thinking about this is, if you're going to make a big economic development investment, how should you be thinking about setting up workforce development so it's a key part of the equation and not just relying on tax incentives alone to drive growth, because without the workers, we all know these industries are not going to be able to get anywhere in the United States. So I think what we've set up here has been a pretty exciting and innovative way of thinking about, one, crowding in not just public capital, but other forms of dollars that can help support these investments in human capital that are going to be needed for the industries to grow. And so, not just in chips, but if you look at the Tech Hubs program and BBRC, et cetera, they're all thinking about the federal dollars as accompanying private dollars, state dollars, et cetera. Like you have a sort of a whole package of capital that's coming together to execute on a strategy. And then a second piece that I've been thinking about a lot is the intermediary model, which we have a very particular form that this is taking for chips. But if you look at some of the other commerce programs as well, they've really been designed thoughtfully with a structure around what are the different roles that need to be played in an ecosystem and how do we align incentives so that the right set of actors around the table are playing those roles. In chips, that's meant helping industry and companies be able to focus on what they do best, operating their companies, upskilling their employees, executing on their strategy for competitiveness. And then they're working with nonprofit partners in their regions that can really help convene all of the different education and training partners that have a role to play in helping to advance their plan. Can also help with the kind of the compliance and fiduciary responsibility around deploying federal funds, and the ambitiousness of the data collection and performance management piece of this, actually having an external partner that can help in understanding who needs to provide data and when, and really managing those relationships is another piece of this. So I'm excited about the model that's been set up here. And I think it really provides a promising way for non federal entities as well to think about setting up a structure for deploying workforce development resources that will support a new investment in their community.
And, just the scale of the partnerships, the stakeholders you have at the table. I mean, I'd heard it before, but I'm still struck by 80 plus community colleges doing semiconductor programs now. Are you optimistic that those partnerships can outlast some of these grants? That those relationships and the kind of new way will last beyond this work?
Yes. I mean, I think that what you'll see in these regions is that the entities that are working the closest together are going to be the ones that are moving them fastest and the partnerships that really sustain for the years to come. I talk about this a lot, but you can tell a lot when you go to a region and understand if the education and community partners were sort of like there at the table at the very beginning when a new company came into the region and was interested in investing, or a firm that's been there for a long time and is expanding. You can tell from those conversations, are these set of people that have been working together in a sustained, coordinated way?
Right.
And in some cases, I think when that hasn't existed, the commerce programs have really helped to like catalyze and kickstart those conversations, facilitated in ways by some of these convening partners. But the strength of the partnership and the collaboration between the education system, the training partners, and the companies will endure so long as both sides hold up on their bargain, which is we're going to deliver on good jobs for our community. And on the education and training side, we're going to be able to produce the highly skilled, diverse talent that you need to get these facilities off the ground, to grow them, to expand them, to support all of the follow on investment that can come as a result. So I do think there's some high startup costs in the beginning in getting some of these partnerships and ecosystems going. But over time, in places where it's working, it becomes a well oiled machine that's bringing in the other sources of capital, growing and expanding in scale, supporting people in adjacent industries. So, I'm excited to look back a decade from now to some of these chips communities and see really the catalytic impact that some of these initial investments have had. Even in Phoenix, if you look at TSMC's announcements, there's already 14 suppliers that have now announced as a result in the surrounding area. So again, it's not just about preparing a pipeline for one individual firm in this kind of industry, which has high multiplier effects. There's really an ecosystem effect. And so the regions that do this well I think we're all going to be looking back at them to see what we can learn from their work.
Lots of vision and goals I think we can all get behind. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. Appreciate the time. Always a great conversation. Look forward to seeing what's next.
Thanks for tuning into The Cusp. We're available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe. You can visit us at thecusp.ai. The launch of this podcast was made possible by the collective philanthropic support of the Walmart Foundation, GitLab Foundation, Cognizant, and the Kapor Center. Thanks to our supporters and to you all for listening. Catch you next time.